My daughter passed me the gravy boat at Thanksgiving dinner, and when I reached for it, I felt her fingers curl around my wrist for just a second. Firm. Deliberate. Not an accident. I looked up at her. She gave me nothing. Just a small smile, the kind she used when she was 12 and hiding something from her mother. Then she looked back down at her plate. Under the gravy boat was a folded napkin. I palmed it without looking, kept talking to my son-in-law about the Canucks game, laughed at the right moments, passed the potatoes to my wife across the table. I unfolded the napkin in my lap. My daughter's handwriting, small and pressed hard into the paper like she'd been writing fast. Dad. Something is wrong with Marcus. I think he's been lying to me. Please don't say anything tonight. I need your help. I refolded the napkin into my jacket pocket. Finished my turkey. Told Marcus it was a fine bird, and meant it. He'd cooked it himself, which I had to admit was decent of him. After dinner, when Marcus was loading the dishwasher and my wife was showing him where we kept the good container lids, my daughter found me in the living room. She sat beside me on the arm of the chair, close, pretending to look at photos on the mantel. How long? I said quietly. 3 weeks of suspicion. 3 days of knowing something is actually wrong. She didn't look at me. I need you to be you, Dad. The old you. I understood what she meant. She meant the version of me I'd kept mostly quiet for the past 11 years. My name is Gordon Shields. I'm 63 years old. Most people who know me now know me as a retired insurance man from Kelowna, the kind who volunteers at the food bank on Saturdays and takes his granddaughter to the farmer's market on Sunday mornings. My wife calls me the most boring interesting person she knows, which I take as a compliment. What most people don't know is that for 22 years before I settled into that comfortable life, I worked as a fraud investigator for the RCMP's Financial Crimes Division. I spent 2 decades pulling apart Ponzi schemes, tracing hidden assets, building cases against people who were extraordinarily good at looking trustworthy. I retired voluntarily at 52 because my wife had a health scare that turned out to be nothing, but it reminded me that I'd promised her a life, not just a career. I kept that promise. I haven't missed the work. But I never forgot how to do it. That night, after Marcus had gone to help my wife clear the dining room, my daughter told me everything. She'd met Marcus Webb at a conference in Calgary 18 months earlier. He was charming in the way that read as genuine, attentive without being pushy, funny without trying too hard. He worked in private wealth management, he said. Handled portfolios for high net worth clients, mostly based in Vancouver and Toronto. He talked about finance the way people talk about something they actually love, not something they perform for money. They dated long distance for 6 months before he relocated to Kelowna to be closer to her. Within another 6 months, they were married. My daughter was 34. She was happy. I liked him well enough. He asked good questions and he listened to the answers, which is rarer than people think. The first time I felt something shift was small. At a barbecue in August, he'd made a comment about real estate in the Okanagan, how the market was moving, how anyone sitting on property in the valley right now was leaving serious money on the table. He looked at me when he said it. Just for a moment. Then looked away. I didn't say anything. I filed it. 3 months later, my daughter called me on a Wednesday night, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the silence before she started talking. That kind of silence means someone is choosing their words. Dad, has Marcus ever talked to you about investing? Not directly, I said. Why? Another pause. He's been asking me a lot of questions about your property. About the orchard land. About what it's worth. My wife and I own 6 acres outside Kelowna that her family has held since the 1960s. It's worth considerably more now than it was then, given what the valley has become. We lease it to a neighbor who runs a small operation on it. It's not generating significant income, but the land itself is worth somewhere around $1.4 million. What kind of questions? I asked. Like, has there ever been a professional appraisal? Like, what are your plans for it when you retire from everything? Like, whether you've thought about using it as collateral for investment vehicles. I told her I'd talk to Marcus. She asked me not to. Not yet. Just watch him for a while, she said. I might be imagining things. She wasn't imagining things. But I didn't know how badly wrong this was until Thanksgiving. The night after the holiday, she came to the house while Marcus was at a dinner with a client. She spread documents across my kitchen table, sat across from me with both hands flat on the surface like she was trying to keep herself steady. 3 weeks before, Marcus had asked her to sign a power of attorney. For what purpose? I said. He said it was for financial planning. So he could manage our combined accounts more efficiently while he was traveling for work. She looked at me steadily. I signed it, Dad. I thought it was routine. He's my husband. I looked at the document. It wasn't routine. It was broad. It gave Marcus authority over her individual assets as well as joint ones. It included property held in her name, which included a half interest in a small rental unit she'd bought before the marriage. Is there more? I said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a second document. A term sheet from an investment vehicle called Ridgecrest Capital Partners. Marcus was listed as a managing partner. I read it slowly. The investment was structured as a limited partnership. The minimum entry was $250,000. The promised returns were between 14% and 18% annually, described as consistent with historical performance. The capital contributions were secured, the document said, against the fund's real estate holdings and diversified portfolio assets. I've seen documents like this hundreds of times. The language was professional. The layout was clean. The numbers were designed to look credible without being verifiable. When did he show you this? I asked. Last week. He said he was offering it to a small circle of investors, people he trusted. He said with your property as collateral for a bridge loan, we could participate at a level that would set us up for the next 20 years. I set down the document. Has he mentioned this to your mother and me directly? He was going to at Thanksgiving, she said. That's why I needed to warn you. He had a whole thing planned. The dinner, the mood, and then the ask. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She's been reading people since she was 8 years old. She notices things. When she was a teenager, she told me that the man who came to fix our furnace was lying about what was wrong with it. She was right. I'd raised her to pay attention, to trust what she observed. She'd married a man who'd made her doubt herself for trusting her instincts. That mattered to me more than the money. Do you still have access to everything? I said. Accounts, emails, any correspondence with this fund? I have my own login to our joint account. He controls the investment account separately. She hesitated. I also have his laptop login. He gave it to me 8 months ago in case of emergency and never changed it. Don't touch anything, I said. Don't move any money, don't forward any emails, don't let him know you've looked. Can you do that? Yes. Good. I stood up. Let me make some calls. The next morning I called the first person I needed. Sheila Baxter was my supervisor for the last 7 years I was with the division. She'd retired 2 years before me and now ran a small consultancy out of Halifax doing exactly the kind of work I used to do, except for private clients and insurance firms. She picked up on the second ring. Gordon Shields, she said. I was starting to think you'd actually gone soft. I need a favor, I said. Informal. Off the books. Of course you do. What is it? I gave her everything I had. Marcus Webb, Ridgecrest Capital Partners, the term sheet, the power of attorney, the property angle. She took notes in the shorthand we'd both used for 2 decades. I could hear her writing. I'll run what I can through public records and securities filings, she said. Give me 48 hours. The second call I made was to a man named Terrence Collard. Terry had been a forensic accountant we'd worked with on 3 major cases, and after he left public service he'd set up in Vancouver doing private consulting. I'd helped him through a difficult deposition in 2012 and he told me then that he owed me. I was calling to collect. Send me the documents, he said, after I'd explained. If this fund is registered anywhere in Canada, I'll find it. If it isn't registered, that's even more interesting. The third call I made was to a woman named Andrea, but not for investigative help. Andrea is my daughter's best friend. She's a family law solicitor in Kelowna, and she has been since she passed the bar 14 years ago. I asked her whether, hypothetically, a power of attorney signed under incomplete disclosure about the nature and breadth of the document could be challenged. Hypothetically, she said carefully, if someone could demonstrate that the person signing didn't have full informed understanding of what they were granting, and especially if there was evidence of intent to use that authority for purposes not disclosed at signing, yes. There are grounds. A pause. Is this about your daughter? I told her I would call her back. Sheila was back in 36 hours, not 48. Ridgecrest Capital Partners, she said. Incorporated in Alberta 2 years ago. One registered director, Marcus E. Webb. The company has filed no prospectus, registered no securities offerings with any provincial securities commission, and has no audited financial statements on record anywhere I can find. She paused to let that sit. It's not registered to offer securities in any province. So any investment solicitation is illegal, I said. Every conversation he's had about it with a potential investor is already an offense under the Securities Act. She went on. I also ran Marcus Webb personally. There's a Marcus Edward Webb who held a mutual fund dealer license in Ontario until 9 years ago. That license was suspended following a client complaint. The case was resolved with a settlement and a 3-year prohibition from acting as a dealing representative. What was the complaint? Unsuitable investment recommendations. A retired couple in Hamilton. He'd moved their entire retirement savings into high-risk leveraged products. They lost approximately $340,000. I sat with that for a moment. The couple in Hamilton. Someone's parents. Someone's savings, gone because they trusted the man across the table who asked good questions and listened to the answers. Is he currently holding any license? Not in any province. He's operating without registration. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in my kitchen for a while with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, thinking about the particular kind of person it takes to do what Marcus Webb had done. Meet a woman. Marry her. Spend 18 months building credibility and trust inside a family, learning the shape of their assets, mapping the land. All of it engineered toward a moment at a holiday dinner when an old man could be handed a pen. Terry Collard called the next morning. There are no real estate holdings, he said, without preamble. The fund documents reference a diversified portfolio of properties and market instruments. I went looking for those properties. They don't exist. At least 2 addresses listed as fund holdings are vacant lots in Red Deer that are owned by a numbered company with no connection to Ridgecrest or Webb that I can find. He paused. Gordon, there are no assets. The fund is a shell. Any other investors? That's what concerns me. I found references to 4 other investors who appear to have contributed capital in the past 18 months. I can't identify them all, but one name came up in a document he didn't redact properly. A woman in Saskatoon. Retired schoolteacher. She contributed $75,000 11 months ago and there's no record of any return payment. A retired schoolteacher in Saskatoon who contributed $75,000 and never heard back. Can you document all of this in a format that would support a referral to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Division? I asked. I already started, he said. I didn't tell my daughter everything immediately. I told her enough. I told her the fund was not registered, that Marcus had no current license, and that the power of attorney needed to be revoked as soon as possible without alerting him. Andrea was ready for that call. She had the revocation documents prepared within a day. My daughter signed them at Andrea's office on a Thursday afternoon while Marcus was in Vancouver for a meeting. Then I asked my daughter to do something that was harder than signing documents. I need you to keep acting normal, I said. I need you to let him believe you're still on board. I need a few more days. She looked at me across the kitchen table, and I saw something I recognized from when she was small, from the times I'd had to explain something difficult to her about how the world worked. That particular look of wanting to trust the answer but needing to understand it first. Why, she said. Because if he runs before we have everything documented and submitted, we lose the ability to help the other people he's done this to. The woman in Saskatoon. Whoever else is out there. I held her eyes. You and I are safe. We have everything we need. But I want to make sure he can't walk away from this and do it again somewhere else. She was quiet for a moment. You've done this before. Many times. With real criminals. They were real criminals, I said. So is he. She nodded. Okay. What do I do? We agreed that Marcus would make his formal pitch to me and my wife the following weekend. He'd already mentioned wanting to get together, wanting to talk about something that could benefit the family. My daughter confirmed she hadn't tipped him off. As far as he knew, she was the quiet partner who'd signed the document he needed, and all that remained was to get the old man's signature on the orchard. I spent the week preparing. I called the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement team in Vancouver. I knew the regional director slightly, a man named Peterson who'd come up through the ranks about a decade after me. I explained the situation, sent him Sheila's report and Terry's documentation. He called me back the next day. This is solid, Gordon, he said. We can work with this. Is there any chance of documented solicitation? A recording of him making the offer directly? I'll see what I can do, I said. My wife, when I told her the full story that evening, was quiet for a long time. He came to our Thanksgiving, she said finally. He did. He ate my stuffing and told me it was better than his mother's. I know. She looked at me. She's known me for 36 years. She knows what I look like when I'm already halfway through a plan. Tell me what you need me to do, she said. Marcus arrived at our house on a Saturday afternoon with a bottle of BC wine and that same warm ease he always carried. He embraced my wife, helped bring in the chairs from the porch without being asked about our neighbor's dog by name. He was genuinely good at it. That's the part that never stops being unsettling, how fluent some people are at warmth they don't mean. We sat in the living room. My wife brought coffee. We talked about the weather and the season and how quickly the grandchildren were growing. Then Marcus leaned forward slightly, the way people do when they're about to say something they've rehearsed as sounding spontaneous. I wanted to talk to you both about something, he said. An opportunity I've been sitting on that I think could be significant for our family's future. I let him talk. He was polished. He moved through the pitch carefully, the fund structure, the returns, the exclusivity. He mentioned the 14% figure. He talked about the Valley real estate market, how the orchard land was appreciating, how it made sense to put those assets to work rather than let them sit. He said he wanted to bring us in at the ground level, as family, with favorable terms. I let him finish. Then I said, Marcus, before I respond to any of this, I want to ask you a few questions. Just to make sure I understand what I'd be signing. Of course, he said. He smiled. Open, receptive. Ridgecrest Capital Partners is registered to offer securities in British Columbia? A small pause. The smile held. We operate under a registration exemption for qualified investors. The paperwork is in order. Which exemption specifically? The accredited investor exemption under National Instrument 45106. And the assets listed in the fund prospectus as collateral. The properties in Red Deer. Are those currently held in the fund's name or in a related holding company? The smile was working harder now. They're held through a subsidiary structure for tax efficiency. Standard practice. I'd like to see the title registrations, I said. Of course. I can get those to you. And the audited financial statements for the fund's last fiscal year. He shifted slightly. We're a young fund. We've operated on reviewed statements up to this point. National Instrument 52109 requires audited statements for reporting issuers. Are you a reporting issuer? Marcus looked at me for a moment without speaking. Something was recalibrating behind his eyes. Gordon, he said, and his voice was still smooth, I think you might be overcomplicating this. This is a family conversation. We're not in a boardroom. No, I said. We're in my living room, and you're asking me to pledge $1.4 million in land as collateral for a fund that has no audited financials, no registered prospectus, and no verifiable underlying assets. I set down my coffee cup. Your securities dealer license was suspended in Ontario 9 years ago following client losses of $340,000. You currently hold no license to act as a dealing representative in any province of Canada. Ridgecrest Capital Partners is not registered with the British Columbia Securities Commission, the Alberta Securities Commission, or any other provincial regulator. He said nothing. A retired schoolteacher in Saskatoon contributed $75,000 to your fund 11 months ago. I'd like to know what happened to her money. My wife was very still beside me. She'd known it was coming, but hearing it laid out that way, she told me later it was like watching something solid turn hollow. Marcus stood. I don't know where you're getting this, but you're making serious accusations. I'm asking questions, I said. Which you haven't answered. I think I should go. You're welcome to leave, I said. I want you to know that everything I've just described has been documented and submitted to the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team in Vancouver. They've been aware of this file for 5 days. I also want you to know that my daughter revoked the power of attorney you had her sign 9 days ago. He looked toward the hallway, instinctively, as if expecting her to appear. She's not here, I said. And she won't be taking your calls. I'd strongly suggest you speak to a lawyer before you do anything else. He left the bottle of wine on the end table. He didn't say goodbye. My wife and I sat in the living room after his car had left the driveway. She poured herself a little more coffee. Outside, the valley light was going golden over the hills. I liked him, she said quietly. I know. That's the worst part of it. I genuinely liked him. That's what makes it work, I said. People like that count on being liked. It's the main tool. She was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Now we let the system work. The RCMP moved on Marcus Webb 2 weeks later. The charges were serious: fraud over $5,000, multiple counts of illegal distribution of securities, and breach of trust in connection with the power of attorney. When investigators pulled his records fully, the picture expanded. Ridgecrest Capital Partners had solicited investments from 11 individuals in 4 provinces over a 2-year period. Total capital raised, approximately $1.1 million. Of that, less than $200,000 could be traced to any actual investment activity. The rest had moved through a series of shell accounts to fund Marcus's living expenses, travel, and the kind of lifestyle that looked successful enough to attract the next investor. The woman in Saskatoon was named Frances. She was 67. She'd put in every dollar of a GIC that had matured from her late husband's life insurance. When the RCMP contacted her, she said she'd been too ashamed to tell her children she might have been defrauded. She'd been waiting 11 months, telling herself returns were just delayed. There were others. A young couple in Edmonton who'd contributed $30,000 they'd been saving for a down payment. A business owner in Victoria who'd put in $150,000 after Marcus had spent 3 months building a relationship with him through a charity golf tournament. An elderly man in Winnipeg whose son had connected Marcus to his father after Marcus had befriended the son at a gym. They were all shapes and sizes, all reasons, all entry points. That's the thing about people who run these schemes long enough, they don't have one approach. They have as many approaches as there are people to read. My daughter moved back into our house while the investigation was underway and the marriage was legally unwound. She was clear-eyed about it in a way that I think surprised her more than anyone. "I don't feel stupid," she told me one evening. "I feel angry." Which I think is better. It was better. Anger means you're still standing. She filed for annulment on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation, which Andrea told her was strong given the circumstances. The process was not fast, and it was not painless, but it was straightforward. The law was clear enough once the facts were clear. Marcus Webb pleaded not guilty, which extended the timeline but didn't change the outcome. Terry's documentation was precise. Sheila's report was thorough. The RCMP had conducted their own parallel investigation that corroborated everything and expanded well beyond what I'd initially found. The Crown prosecutor, a sharp woman from the Vancouver office named Meredith Grant, told me when we spoke that it was one of the cleaner cases she'd taken to trial, not because it was simple, but because the fraud had left a clear trail once someone who knew what to look for had started pulling threads. The trial was in April. My daughter testified. She was composed in a way that clearly frustrated the defense, because there was nothing to rattle. She stated facts. She answered questions directly and did not elaborate beyond what was asked. Afterward, the defense lawyer tried to suggest she'd signed the power of attorney knowingly, that she'd understood its scope. Meredith closed that down with 3 questions and a document. I testified as an expert witness, which Peterson at the RCMP had formally requested given my background. I explained the structure of the scheme, how it compared to patterns I'd investigated during my career, the specific mechanisms that made it illegal. I was in the box for most of a morning. The defense attempted to characterize me as a biased father seeking revenge. Meredith's redirect took 4 minutes. "Mr. Shields, in your 22 years with the RCMP Financial Crimes Division, approximately how many fraud investigations did you lead or co-lead?" "Just over 280, I said. "And how many of those resulted in convictions?" 231. "Thank you. No further questions." The jury deliberated for 1 full day and part of a second morning. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge addressed Marcus directly. He said that what made this offense particularly serious was not merely the financial harm, though that was real and substantial, but the method. The deliberate construction of trust. The marriage entered as an instrument of access. The targeting of elderly and retired individuals, people who had worked their entire lives to build something and were vulnerable to promises of security. Marcus Webb received 11 years in federal prison. Full restitution was ordered to all identified victims. Frances, the schoolteacher from Saskatoon, received her $75,000 back through the restitution process. Her daughter called me after the sentencing to tell me that. I hadn't expected the call. She said her mother had told her I was the one who'd started the investigation, and she wanted to say thank you. I didn't know what to say to that, which is unusual for me. I told her I was glad her mother was going to be okay. Which was true and also not quite enough. My daughter came through the other side of it changed in ways I was still learning to see. She was more careful, yes. More measured in what she trusted. But she hadn't become cynical, which I'd been quietly worried about, because cynicism is its own kind of damage. What she'd developed instead was something more useful, a cleaner sense of her own judgment. She'd known something was wrong before she had any evidence. She'd trusted that knowledge enough to write a note on a napkin at Thanksgiving dinner. That instinct had been right, and now she knew it had been right, which meant she'd always know that about herself going forward. One morning in June, she brought her daughter to our house, my granddaughter, who was 7 and extraordinarily interested in why Grandpa had a filing cabinet with a lock on it. "What's in there?" she asked me, with the absolute directness of a child who hasn't learned yet that some questions aren't asked. Old work, I said. What kind of work? I looked at my daughter over the top of her head. My daughter smiled. Your grandpa used to find people who were lying, my daughter said. When it was really important. My granddaughter considered this with great seriousness. Like a detective? Sort of, I said. Can you still do it? I thought about Sheila, who had called me 2 days after the verdict to say she had another situation she wanted my read on, just informally, just to help her think through it. I thought about Terry, who'd sent me a file with a note that said simply, "You still have the eye." When it matters, I said to my granddaughter, yes. She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to the farmer's market vegetables on the counter, which interested her considerably more than the locked filing cabinet once she'd decided it wasn't treasure. My wife came in from the garden and washed her hands at the sink and looked around at the three of us in her kitchen on a Saturday morning, and she said nothing, which was the right response, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. Months passed. My daughter found herself again in the quiet way that people do when they stop having to perform okayness and can just actually be okay. She took on more clients at her firm. She went back to the hiking trails she'd stopped visiting when Marcus had said he found them boring. She had dinner with old friends she'd drifted from during the marriage, and those friendships came back easily, because real ones generally do. She started seeing someone the following spring. A man she'd known peripherally for years through a mutual friend. He was a veterinarian from Penticton, calm and funny, not particularly impressive in any showy way, which was, I suspected, exactly the point. She brought him to Sunday dinner one afternoon in April, about 14 months after that Thanksgiving. I watched him the same way I watched everyone. Not suspiciously, but carefully. There's a difference. He noticed the photos in the hallway, the ones from our camping trips when the kids were small. He asked good questions about them. He didn't talk about himself until asked. When my granddaughter climbed onto the couch beside him without invitation, which is her particular form of character assessment, he just shifted slightly to give her more room and kept talking. After he'd left that evening, my wife asked me what I thought. He's fine, I said. She laughed. High praise. He's good, I corrected. I think he's good. She put her hand on my arm for a moment, the way she does when something has settled, and then went to check on the dishes. I stayed in the doorway, looking out at the orchard land in the evening light, the 6 acres that had almost been used as a tool against my family by a man who had looked at my life and seen something exploitable. He hadn't known what he was walking into. He'd seen a quiet house and the modest car and an old man who talked about volunteering in farmers' markets, and he'd made the mistake that everyone who miscalculates me makes. He'd assumed that unassuming meant unprepared. I thought about all the people who weren't prepared. The couples in Edmonton saving for a house. The business owner in Victoria who'd done nothing wrong except be friendly at a charity event. Frances in Saskatoon, sitting alone with a depleted account, telling herself it would come right, too ashamed to tell her children. Good people who'd trusted the wrong person and had no one in the room who knew how to stop it. You can't protect everyone. I learned that a long time ago, and I've had to make peace with it more than once. But sometimes you can protect the person in front of you, and let that become something bigger than you planned. The restitution payments to victims were completed 9 months after the sentencing. Meredith's office sent me a summary. 11 families. Just over $1 million recovered and returned. Not everything they'd lost, the time, the trust, the months of dread, but the money, which was something. Meredith was also involved in pushing for updated guidance from the British Columbia Securities Commission on unsolicited investment offers made in personal relationships, the boyfriend, the son-in-law, the friendly neighbor. The kind of fraud that uses intimacy as its delivery system. The new guidance wasn't a law, but it was a step. It told people what to look for. It named the pattern. That matters more than people realize, naming a pattern. Once something has a name, it becomes possible to recognize it before it's too late. My daughter called me on a Tuesday evening in November, almost 2 years after that Thanksgiving dinner. I've been thinking, she said. About? About that napkin. About writing that note. She paused. I almost didn't. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was seeing problems because I was anxious, that I should give him more time and more benefit of the doubt. But you wrote it anyway. I wrote it because I thought, what if I'm right? What's the cost of being wrong if I write it and he turns out to be fine? And what's the cost of not writing it if I'm right? I'd taught her that. Not explicitly, not as a lesson, but through the accumulated logic of watching someone think carefully for 34 years. She'd absorbed it, turned it into her own version, applied it in a moment when it counted. You were right, I said. I know. She sounded different than she had 2 years ago. Not harder. Just more settled in herself, the way people sound when they'd passed through something and found out they could. Thank you for being the right person to write it to. I didn't have an answer for that either, which seems to be a recurring theme with this daughter of mine. I told her I loved her, and she said she knew, and we talked for another half hour about nothing in particular, which is its own kind of everything. The filed cabinet is still locked. I'm not sure I'll ever stop adding to it.